Welcome everyone. Good to see so many people with such a strong interest in this critical issue. Those of you who've participated, I know most of us have participated in Zoom calls and webinars before, but just a little kind of refresher. We will, as Janet said, we will have everyone on mute while Louise is doing her presentation. We'd appreciate it if you would also keep your video off once we get started. It just allows us to focus on the presentation that Louise is making, and we don't see everyone's faces for a bit. Please, if you can, type whatever questions as they occur to you in the chat. I'm going to try to monitor the chat function so that once we're ready for questions, Louise can look at it herself, but I will try to make sure we don't lose any critical questions that people wanted to raise. If you're not sure where the chat function is, it's the little kind of talk bubble at the bottom of your screen. Oh yeah, there we have, and Ruth is saying, would love to know where everyone is listening from. And I think that's a great idea. So if everyone wants to just try out the chat by saying where you are joining us from. And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn over to Linda and let her do the introduction to Louise.
Thank you, Pat. I'm delighted to be here with so many of you today to focus our attention on the climate emergency. I'd like just to set a bit of context before I introduce Louise. We know that the negative impacts of climate change are being felt across the world with increasing intensity and frequency of extreme climate events. And some parts of the world are seeing this most profoundly. And so I thought I would give you an example today. So the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa has been described as the epicenter of the climate emergency, with increasing desertification of large tracts of land, a lack of access to water, including loss of 90% of Lake Chad, loss of livelihoods of millions of people, the fishers and farmers and pastoralists, increasing local conflicts over resources, and increasing migration of people out of the area. This next decade is a critical period for ambitious and courageous climate action, both here at home and in support of the most vulnerable people in sub-Saharan Africa. The Climate Strategy Group currently has two broad goals for our advocacy work. The first is to strengthen the Canadian financial commitment to climate mitigation and adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on women. And secondly, to support grants in climate action at the local and regional level, for there's also so much that needs to be done here at home. And today's learning event is focusing on that second goal, climate action here at home and in building capacity for advocacy at the international level. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Louise. Louise Comeau is the newest member of Grand's Climate Strategy Group. She joins us today from Keswick, New Brunswick, where she homesteads with her partner, Tom. And I think homesteading could probably, Louise, be a whole different learning event. I'd love to hear so much more about that. She's a climate change policy and communication specialist with 30 years of experience in developing climate change policy, communications, and programs. She's worked internationally, nationally, provincially, and locally, and continues to do so in addressing climate issues. She has her PhD in forestry and environmental management and her master's in environmental education and communication. She's involved in teaching and research through the University of New Brunswick, and she's doing many, many more things. She was named by Maclean's magazine as one of Canada's 50 most influential people in 2003. We are so fortunate to have Louise as a member of our climate strategy group and to have her here today to share her knowledge and experience. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you. You had some things in there that I didn't even remember. You did some research.
I did.
I'm going to share my screen. And while I do that, I'm going to share computer sound, which is the most critical thing I've learned when you're trying to uh, show a video and you want sound. So I'll just move some things around so that I can show you this. I'm hoping now that everyone can see that the front slide is up, and it's indeed the case. We're going to talk a little bit about the basic story of climate change, and I'm building this story from what I'm calling our lived experience. And this comes from several years of research. You'd think I would have learned these lessons by now, but because many of us are so buried in policy work or so enthusiastic about policy work, we often forget that not everybody's working on this issue from the same stance as we are. And they don't feel as confident about the kind of basics of the issue, but also they want to know more about what they can do in their personal lives as well as through their citizenship. And we'll talk about both. If I can advance my slides, there we are. So I'm going to give you a little overview of the presentation. We're going to talk about some of the climate impacts that we face today. And the reality is that global heating is definitely supercharging our weather. We'll talk about the causes of climate change, things like energy use, the way we make, use, and throw away products we buy, the way we treat nature, build our cities, towns, the way we travel, and how we grow food. And we'll talk about solutions like systems change and the need to electrify everything, mostly. I thought I'd also, though, share with you some of the key messages I hope that we agree at the end of the presentation you also take away. One is that I do feel through the work we do that we do need to have more plain talk on climate change. It is true that together we can make a difference, but it has to be a real difference. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. We definitely need to be thinking from local to global. We can all do our part, but we also need governments, businesses to do the same here in Canada and around the world. So this is a collective action problem and we all need to be doing our bit. And of course, we'll talk about opportunities. And in this context, the key message is that when it comes to environmental issues, and most certainly when it comes to climate change, we need to move beyond recycling, change how we make and use energy, how we grow food, and how we manage forests. So we do, I think, agree and accept, generally speaking, that the climate is changing. That experience can vary depending on where you live. But the key piece I want to leave with you is that, or at least put on the table here, and this is a nice little summary from Catherine Hayhoe. And the basic summary of the climate story is that the problem is caused by us. It's real. It's serious. Scientists agree on the basic physics of the problem, and there's hopes. Here, I just want to talk a little bit about a simple way of thinking about how climate change actually works. This is what we call the blanket metaphor, and it helps us understand the idea that somehow through activities that we do, we're trapping heat. And let me just describe what the process is, and with luck, we get through this section where you really do feel a little bit more confident in your ability to explain climate change to someone else. And the basic idea here is, the planet, just like people, is very sensitive to changes in temperature. If we're too hot or too cold and we're just not comfortable, it's the same in the natural world. And around the world, and in Canada in particular, we are part of a network of countries, northern countries, that have warmed at double the global rate over the last 70 years. And that's almost 2 degrees of warming compared to just over 1 degree globally. And it sounds like a small amount, but what we don't tend to realize is it takes a vast amount of energy to warm the oceans, the land, and the air by just 1 degree. We're at twice that at home, and we're on track for significantly more warming than that. This global heating is changing our weather. Weather patterns are changing. They're becoming more extreme. And that's partly because hotter air absorbs more water. It fuels more intense storms that release more rainfall and snow. So The outcome of that is we see more flooding. It's disrupting our lives. We see that soil becomes contaminated, food. Here's an example in New Brunswick, for example, spring flooding. People do a lot of foraging in spring for things like fiddleheads. People are worried about contamination. There's the food aspect. There's also, of course, displacement from homes and all of that, of what goes with that. We are seeing more heat waves, which affects our health. Drought is making it harder to grow food, and I can attest to that, having lived through quite a significant drought over the last year. And of course, we see hotter temperatures leading to increased risk from disease, things from ticks and mosquitoes and so on. So the basic idea from these effects that we're experiencing is that the gases that we generate when we burn oil, coal, and natural gas, and from cutting trees and the way we manage our industrial agriculture and forests, we are generating gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, that's forming a blanket around the Earth that's trapping heat at the Earth's surface. And these gases last hundreds and hundreds of years. And so the historic energy balance is being disrupted. And as a result, we're seeing this increase in temperature, which is supercharging the weather. So when you're thinking about climate change, you're thinking about what's happening, you're thinking about heat at the Earth's surface, or the surface that we basically live in. So the plain talk on this is that we are running out of time. And of course, the reality, as Linda described already, is that the most vulnerable pay. And the core truth here is that the only way to stop the pollution causing climate change is for all of us to work together. We have to shrink global emissions to less than half today's levels in the next 10 years. And then we have to get to basically zero. You'll hear the term net zero. The idea is basically net zero is zero for our purposes right now within the next 30 years. And that's a lot, but it's worth the effort. And so one of the things I've done with my research and that I want to share with you is the idea that we can do what we need to do for climate for many reasons. But I think the main reason is that we can do it for the love. And this is a project that I've been doing with the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. And what that project has led to is the creation of a series of videos where we've had people just talk about what they love to do. And then we share in a gentle way how it is that climate change could affect that. And again, it's about this idea that emotions are what motivate people. Sometimes those can be emotions around fear or anger, but love really sustains us. And I'm just going to show you this video if everything works right, and you'll see what we're talking about.
I love the salmon fish, and it's been a passion, I would almost say an addiction, for 45 years. It's a release, it really is, from the worries of the world, so to speak. And I love being out in the outdoors, enjoying the beauty of nature. It's my paradise here and God's cathedral.
So these videos, there's 13 of them, 12, 3 per season, and one solutions video, which I will show you. And what we have found is that coming at this conversation with people through the things they care about opens the opportunity for a collective conversation, a sharing of our concerns, but in a less exclusive way than when we start talking, oh, let's start talking about carbon pricing. So I hope you like that video. And the For the Love of portal at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick has incredible amount of information, including some of the graphics I'm about to show you. So the key issue here, of course, is that if we don't get a handle on our energy and land use, humans and natural systems could face an additional warming of 3 degrees. And we know that the world's leading climate scientists say that average warming of just even another 0.5 degree puts the world at grave danger. So we need to act urgently. We need to act rapidly. And we need to think about what we need to do in the context of this idea. And it builds on another metaphor, the bathtub, that helps people understand a little bit of why the scale is so great relative to perhaps the way we've had to talk about, say, other issues, whether it's maybe the emissions causing acid rain, a small decline there, you can see pretty good improvement right away. But climate change is not like that. So we need to think of the atmosphere like a bathtub, and it's filling up fast. And if you look at the middle of the bathtub, you'll see that it says half of greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for decades to hundreds of years. So just think of each year. If you look on the left of the panel, you'll see that we've got housing and agriculture, transportation, oil and gas, electricity, air travel. All these things are combusting fuels, generating emissions like carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. And essentially think of those emissions going into the air as a tap, and that tap is turned on full. At the bottom of the bathtub, you'll see that we note only half of the greenhouse gases we put into the air every year are absorbed by natural processes, whether through photosynthesis from trees and plants and soils in the ocean. And what that means is that every year, about 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases go into the air, and about half of that stays in the air. And so what happens is we've got two options here. If we want to stop the atmosphere from filling up and driving greater temperature increases, we've got to turn off the tap, if you look at the right-hand side, and we've got to widen the drain. And we'll talk about the solutions in terms of turning off the tap, things like electrifying transportation and cycling and walking where we can, cleaner energy, and widening the drain through protecting and growing healthy forests and soils. And this graphic just gives you a little bit of more information about what that looks like, or how we might think of this turning off the tap process. So again, if you look on the right, you'll see that the biggest solution is changing our energy systems. In fact, the size of these images here actually tell you what they contribute to overall solutions, how important they are. So renewable energy, solar, wind, and hydro, we need much more electrified economy. Our transportation needs to be electrified. And really, in the end, as complicated as solving climate change might sound, it comes down to kind of the three big things: cleaning up electricity, and then electrifying everything, and then restoring and protecting nature. So on the restoring and protecting nature, what we're actually trying to do is strengthen or protect the carbon cycle, which does a very good job of managing carbon through natural processes, as I say, photosynthesis. And so the solutions are, in terms of widening the drain, is we have to end deforestation as fast as we possibly can. We need to be working extensively on restoring nature, conserving nature, supporting habitat protection, biodiversity protection, but also protecting the oceans. And we need to be looking at what we call regenerative agriculture, regenerative forestry, meaning that we're engaging in those activities in ways that we're not taking more from the soil or from the forest itself than it can sustain itself. And we're actually making it better. We're improving soil, we're improving forest cover, and so on. If we do these things, the opportunity is that we can eventually bring the Earth's energy balance back into balance, and we can avoid dangerous global heating. And so it does mean that we have to move beyond recycling. And we do have to help people come to understand that their role in solutions, both in their lifestyle choices, but also in their citizenship, needs to look at questions of energy, food, and how we manage our forests. I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of us can do in our own lifestyle and household choices, because people have asked for that. But I don't want that to be interpreted like we don't understand that governments and businesses also have to do the same and more to make it easy for householders and communities and citizens to do what they want to do. But also because we can't get to where we want to go if we don't change the structure, whether it's our infrastructure and so on, to help us do what we can do. But one of the most important things doesn't take any physical change at all, and that is to talk about it. What we know from social science research is that when we talk to somebody about an issue that's of concern to us, we signal to the people who care about us what's important to us. And we do know that when we do talk about it, understanding increases, people are more open to doing something, but just as importantly, what happens is people tend to think, oh, I care about climate change, but somebody else doesn't. And what we find is that most of the people we know also are concerned about it. They're just not sure what to do. And so talking about it is the key first step. We also have power to manage our households. And one of the things we often hear is, don't blame the individual for problems that are companies' fault, if it's oil and gas companies, or if it's utilities or governments. And I'm not going to debate that. I'm simply going to share this piece of information. And that is that just under 20% of Canada's emissions actually come from direct energy consumption in the home, whether that's our refrigerators, our water heaters, our furnaces, and our transportation. If we add the things we buy, so those products that we consume and the emissions that go from producing those, we get up to about 40% of Canada's emissions can be traced back to households. And if we add flying, it's even higher than that. So we have a lot of power. It is definitely the role of governments and companies to change and to make this easy for us, but we can make things happen through the choices that we make. And so again, just to make this point again about jumping out of the blue box, I do know from my own work, and you may also have found it as well, that we did actually train, and particularly in schools and so on, we really still emphasize recycling as a solution to environmental issues. And there's nothing wrong with that. Waste is a real issue that has to be managed, but we also have to give people the capacity to expand their understanding of what environmental work is. And what our options are. And so people on the climate change front need to kind of move out of the blue box and think a little bit more about the energy that they use. And in that context, we can work with where people are at. Plastic is something that's on people's minds a lot, both in the plastic that they're using, but also that we know is now in the oceans and causing us great concern. But of course, plastic comes from oil and natural gas. And that generates about 4% of Canada's emissions. So just from a greenhouse gas point of view. And of course, so from that point of view, it's not a huge contributor to climate change, but we know that, of course, plastic takes hundreds of years to break down into the environment, that it's toxic, and that it needs to be dealt with. So one of the ways we may be able to engage people from where they are is to talk about plastic and how that also is made from oil and natural gas. A whopping 58% of all the food produced in Canada, over 35 million tons, is lost or wasted, according to a report I have in the notes to this. You can see the link. And about a third of that wasted food could be rescued and sent to communities in need across the country. So, these ideas about waste really lead us to think about ideas like the circular economy, closing the loops. There should be no one-way processes, whether it's in our production or in our food systems or waste systems. Everything's a resource potentially, and we need to look at it that way. So I just thought you might want, just on this food topic, because food is something we can all get a handle on. I thought I'd show you a second video, and it's of our homestead. So I thought you might appreciate that. And, you know, we can cut our food related emissions when food doesn't go to landfill. For example, we reduce a greenhouse gas called methane. If we're eating less meat or trying not to eat meat from larger industrial operations, we can help reduce methane. And, you know, producing food's about 8% of Canada's emissions. If you look at it on a what we consume point of view, I know we've all seen numbers that are far higher than that. I mean, well over 20, 25% and so on. So let me just show you this video and see if this makes you feel good too.
Oh, I love gardening. Nothing takes the edge off, or let's just say the darkness of the winter, than getting your hands in the dirt. I feel like we're carrying on a tradition that's a part of New Brunswick where people are more self-sufficient and they grow their own food. I really love gardening, not just because it's helping us be sustainable, but it's really good for your mental and physical health. You know, it's not just even being part of nature, but it's about creating beauty in the world. It's like painting artwork. It's like a painting, but you don't actually see it right away. You have to imagine it in your head, and then by fall, you'll see what your art delivered.
And here is what my cold room looks like with all of our food from the garden. And you can see we've got lots of onions this year, and we order in large formats, and our garlic is there, and our squash and our pumpkins, and this is the preserves. So I have 3 of these kinds of shelves. We do our own maple syrup and our own preserves for apples, and salsas of every kind, and herbs, and tomato paste, and I make my own garlic powder, and we do all sorts of things. So the joys and pleasures of becoming more associated with food, and it's a wonderful way to bring a lifestyle imbalance on the low carbon side. So again, not everybody needs to do the scale that we are doing. Of course, we can be any way we want to be with food and make a nice contribution. And that can be supporting a local and food sovereignty, wasting less food, expanding our food options so that we eat less red meat and industrially raised meat, dairy, and incorporating more plant-based and fiber-rich foods into our diet. Growing more of our own food where you can. And I started in a little community garden when I first moved here. We don't all have to have a big garden. So let's talk now about, let me just get my note here to talk about transportation a little bit. So one of the biggest contributors, if you were going to rank, you know, well, where do I start? What's the biggest thing I can do? Let me give you the ranking here. So number 1 is actually the vehicle. It's about 5 tons a year. And you can double that if you're flying, because one international flight can pretty well wipe out most of what we do. It's a sad fact, but it's true. And after that, it's space heating, water heating, appliances, and lighting. So the lighting is not that much. If you're really going to do one thing, think about your vehicle if you can. If you're going to do another thing, think about maybe your refrigerator or your heating or that kind of thing. Those are the things that really will save you money, but also bring greenhouse gases down in terms of your lifestyle. This is a great area to think about that balance between what I can do personally and what governments can do. So we have, for example, the federal government has $5,000 incentives for electric vehicles. If you're fortunate enough to live in BC or Quebec, there's even more. But we also need laws to make all vehicles more energy efficient. That's maybe going to happen now with President Biden in place. Canada is likely to match his strengthening of standards. And we need to invest more in public transit in places where that works. I live in a very rural place, and so we need to look for solutions that make sense wherever we live, rural, suburban, and urban. On the electric side of things, it is the case that not everybody in the country has a 100% non-emitting electricity system. But if you live in Newfoundland, Labrador, BC, Quebec, and Manitoba, you're already, because you're so hydro heavy, pretty clean. If you're in Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, you still have a fair bit of coal that the federal government is regulating, hopefully, out of the system over the next 10 years. But regardless of the mix, even in provinces that do have fossil fuels still in their electricity system, an electric vehicle will be less polluting overall than your internal combustion engine car. So if you can afford it, it's something to think about. I know Tom and I are really struggling. We have a 2003 Prius, and we're like, how long can we hold on to this car to see if we know the next one will be electric, but we want to know that we can get the one that will last us forever. So on the question of flying, it is something that is very much a common part of our reality, and it is one of the fastest growing sources of emissions. In fact, David Suzuki has some on their website, has some great little factoids. If aviation was a nation, it would be one of the top 10 global emitters in the world. It's responsible for a large portion of transportation emissions, 12% overall. And of course, tourism is a big part of that. Airline travel has been increasing rapidly. And, there's only so far you can go. We are looking at obviously options for efficient planes and electrified planes. And we have not just our tourism desires, but our family needs, right? And we call those love miles. Nobody's saying you shouldn't see your family. But we are trying to raise awareness that flying has a huge impact. And, for people who like to travel, that if they can think about what their options are. Tom and I, just as an example, we won't fly for holidays, but occasionally I have to fly for business, and he does not fly for business either. And we try to travel, on holiday in the area where we live. Each of us can also get an audit of our home and take on actions that can retrofit, and you can get a rating, and that rating can improve, and then you get incentives based on that. I'm showing a link to New Brunswick here, but if you go to Natural Resources Canada and look at their EnerGuide program, there's a great little map, and you can click on your province or territory, and they'll tell you what the programs are in your area. It's wonderful to have somebody come in and give you an audit, give you a bit of a plan, and that helps us think through what our options are. When we're buying appliances, we can also look for the EnerGuide label. It's not easy to find. They're often not in the fridge. I know that because I bought a fridge recently, and it takes work to find it, but it is worth trying to know if you are buying an appliance, what the rating is, because it does help you understand if what you're looking at to meet your needs actually uses more or less energy. And then on the question of, solar and wind and helping us get access to the electricity that we want, utilities can generate that power. Some of us will want to do that in our homes. We do need to have governments change the policies and laws. I just did a big project with the Conservation Council looking at that, and I was shocked. I mean, I've worked on this issue a long time, and I was really shocked to learn that, in fact, as angry as I want to be with the utilities or the utility boards, the energy utility boards, for not approving clean energy, or another thing they can't do is spend money on low income retrofits, for example. It's because the legislation managing the utilities actually prevents them from doing it. So I won't get into the details of that, but we do need policy change, and we need changes to the laws, and we need them very quickly. On the nature side of it, we're hearing a lot these days about nature-based solutions. There's a lot of great research coming out showing people love the idea. I'm going to do some more research because I actually don't think people know very much what it actually is yet. I don't know that even many many of us who talk about it know, like we get the idea, it's about protecting forests and restoring wetlands and things. But it's not clear to me that we know what we should do first and how we should do that. But I can say a few little things to you because it's so important. One is that growing trees do store a lot of carbon, but old forests store more. And that's been a myth for a long time that, we'll just, cut down forests and grow new ones and we'll capture carbon. No, old growth forests are just beautiful in themselves and they store a lot of carbon. If you are in a position where you can plant trees, try to think about what will work in your part of the country under a changing climate. So for example, in our part of the world, softwoods under hotter, drier conditions are not projected to do as well as they have in the past. And we live in an area where hardwoods are going to do a lot better. And I would argue that's likely the case in most places in the country. A more diverse forest is important. Hardwoods do better in drought. They are longer lived. And so if you're thinking about tree planting, and please do, it's a joyful thing to do, then think about how those trees will fare in the coming years. So I just want to spend a few minutes on some of the political side of it, the policy side of it. I know from my exposure to just a few of the grants, you guys are very, very smart, very engaged, very, very knowledgeable and active on policy questions. And I just love that you are here and do what you do. So I just wanted to share a few things about this year. It is a really big year on climate change. It's a big year because of the Biden administration bringing momentum, not only to North American efforts, but to the United Nations negotiations, which are active this year as we head toward COP26, the Conference of the Parties meeting for the 26th time in November in Glasgow. And the goal here is to get countries to put stronger targets on the table, because we know from a lot of analysis, as I said, the promises governments have already made to date have us on track for 3 degrees warming or more. This is not acceptable. And so each country is being asked to strengthen their targets for 2030 so that when we add up all of the promises, we know whether or not, and we achieve an outcome that says we're on track with implementation to closer to just a few tenths of a degree increase in warming, as opposed to 1.5 to 3 degrees warming. We're also in an interesting situation as Canada prepares for that. In December, the federal government released an update to its climate plan that closes the gap, because they weren't even on track to meet its current 2030 target. They now have enough measures announced to get them there and just above 31%. The scary part is they're pushing pretty darn hard to get those tons to get us to 31%. And they have to do more. As we know, the scientists want us to get into at least half of our current levels globally. And from an environmental perspective, a justice perspective of what's fair for rich countries to do perspective, the better target for Canada would be 60% below 2005 by 2030. That's double where we are today in 10 years. And so we really are looking forward to the Biden administration and the new opportunities that are coming, hopefully through the vehicle side, as I mentioned, mandates that are require auto manufacturers and sellers to ensure zero emission vehicles are in the marketplace, that we are moving on clean electricity and clean electricity trade. We're regulating things like methane and so on. There are also other priorities right now as well, and I think many of you may have heard of this because I know a number of you are very active on this through, Linda was saying the other day, through oh, I want to say Climate Reality Project, but it's not. It's our wonderful Kathy. It'll come to me. But on C12, this is a Climate Accountability Act. It should have come to second reading perhaps this week. And it legislates the what we call a net zero target by 2050. And all that means is the balance between the emissions from the polluting side, let's call it that, are absorbed. Any of the remaining emissions after we deeply cut, anything that's left is absorbed by either carbon sequestration technologies or natural systems. So basically, that's why I feel comfortable saying zero. The net part, I think, just potentially confuses people. But the idea here is that the government will have a target that it has for 2050 set in law, and it will have 5-year periods from 2030 onward that are also legally kind of in the system. And of course, the lobbying that's going on to improve the bill is that you got to be joking. 2030? No, we have to have a target that we set in place now. That I think that guides us to 2025 and then 25 to 2030. So just a little bit of a detail that those of us who work on these issues are concerned about. We've got lots of great people like Eco Justice and Climate Action Network working on legislation that is worthy of the goal that we have. But the federal government wants to pass that into law by June this year. And that's because they need to bring their new promise to the international system in no later than June, July, because the climate change secretariat within the United Nations system needs to collect everybody's promises, add them up, and then say where we are relative to our temperature limitation goals. So the negotiations can begin or hopefully conclude in November. This last one, there's something else you may hear about. You might hear lots of noise around this in the next little while, so just kind of prepare you for it. It's called the Clean Fuel Standard, and it is a measure that requires refineries to basically add something either to their fuel, like a biofuel, to lower the greenhouse gas intensity of that fuel. It costs money to do this, $94 a ton is the average cost, and that's a lot of money when you add it to the carbon price that the federal government says it wants to implement by 2030, $170 a ton. Both of those together will give us the signal we need in the marketplace to tell people, get that electric car. If you're buying a car, make it really super efficient, because nobody needs to pay the price, right? If you're not using gasoline, if you're not using diesel, if you're not using natural gas, and so on. So the idea here is to give us this period of time between now and when this law basically comes into effect over the next 5 years or so. And that means a lot of on the ground work to help us prepare. It also means retrofitting our homes, especially if you heat with oil, because you don't want to be heating with oil under this regulation. It's just going to be a bit more expensive. And that does help people understand their options for being more energy efficient. So the goal here is not to help people suffer. That's not the goal. The goal is to get us off fossil fuels, and to do that first before these laws and rules and regulations take place. The ultimate goal is not to pay it at all. So just to conclude, the next 10 years make all the difference. The next year makes all the difference. And climate scientists are really sounding the alarm on the urgency in terms of this decade. And so if we work together for real change, we can solve this. We can still write the story we want to tell. I always tear up when I say this. What is that? That we want to tell our grandchildren about how we came together to solve the climate crisis. And of course, our citizenship here matters so much. One of the things we have at the Conservation Council are little tools to help people write letters. One is, about policy, if you're into that, like I'm a person into policy. But we also have a template that says, actually write a letter about how you feel. You don't have to be an expert to tell a politician how you feel about climate change. And then, when you're thinking about your savings or investments, this is just an area when we're older, we're thinking about RSPs, we're thinking where our money is. If we can ensure that our money's in good green work, the divestment movement is having an impact in the world, and we can also participate in that. Okay, so just to kind of reinforce the point, one last little tiny video. When we make these changes, we have lots of reasons to benefit, right? It's not just the climate that benefits, it's biodiversity that benefits, but so do we. Cleaner air, healthier water, safer climate. And so when we invest in a clean electricity system, in particular in protecting nature, it means we can have also careers that make a positive impact on our lives today and into the future. So I'm just going to show you this last little video. It's just a little bit about solutions. It gives you a sense about the power of doing our part. Now, you might wonder, oops, let me just go here and then I'll stop sharing in a moment just to close off. You might wonder about the viability of these kinds of approaches to the videos in the context of these were done for New Brunswick. The reason for that is that we know from the research that we do, and many social scientists show this, that when you tell the story from a local perspective, it's actually what is much more meaningful to people. My dream is to do a series like this on a national basis where we include stories from across Canada, or to have colleagues do similar kinds of things in each of their provinces so we can tell stories from home. Anyway, thank you for your listening, and I'm going to stop sharing so we can actually have a conversation. Okay.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was really a wonderful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I do have a few questions if you would like me to get you started off.
Yes.
First, here's the first one, a good one. What temperature do you keep your cold room?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't keep it at any temperature, partly because it's actually built to be cold on its own. So it's in the basement and it's uninsulated, and then we've got a super insulated door. We do have a thermometer in there because it actually can get below freezing in the winter, and that's too cold for the food. So when that happens, I open the door and we just cool off the basement a little bit more. So it does the work for us.
Great. I'm not surprised at all. Okay. All right. Here's the next question. Isn't meat production a higher contributor to GHGs than transportation? Should we not be putting more energy in quotes into addressing impacts of meat consumption?
Yes. So there are two ways to count greenhouse gas emissions. One is at the level of the producer. So if you are, and the emissions that I reported here are from Canada's inventory, and that is at the level of the producer. So it's the emissions that go with growing food, the tractors and all that stuff, the fertilizers, all of that. When you're actually looking at the life cycle and you look at it on a consumer level, what are all the greenhouse gas emissions that go with food production? Absolutely, food is up there, and of food, beef, lamb are the two highest greenhouse gas emitters. I've seen some numbers that put it in the range of 20% or so of global emissions. But I always see different numbers. And so I'll try to actually put that into the presentation for future so we can have it right in front of us. But I would say that I would rank them in three, your vehicle, or how you get around and you're flying first. I would put your home heating and what's going on in the house, and then maybe the meat eating. I can tell you also that lowering our level of meat consumption is a hard haul, particularly with men. We know from research that men really resist that. There seems to be some association with perceived masculinity issues. And yesterday or this morning, there was an amazing global survey put out on the question of climate change solutions, and meat was actually one that people resisted the most. So that makes it a great target for more education and engagement, because it's a really important thing. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, another one. Joanne had asked if you could talk a little bit more about how at higher temperatures trees will be emitting CO2. And I'm not sure I actually understand the question. So
Yep,
so
great.
if you do, carry on.
Yeah, that's great. So there are, so essentially what we have natural living things, right? Trees in this case absorb CO2 as they breathe in, and they turn that into their biomass and all those great, wonderful things. I won't get into the chemistry, but essentially they grow biomass through this process. And so there are some discussions of the more CO2 in the air, the more that trees would grow. And the argument by some is that that would increase carbon. But what I always say to my students is climate change doesn't travel alone. We're already creating stressors in the system through our forestry and through the ways that we've modified forests over decades and centuries now. And so climate change is an added on stressor. And one of those stressors that comes from climate change itself is hotter, drier conditions. So we know a couple of things, that this idea that trees might absorb more CO2 as the CO2 concentration goes up or as it gets warmer is counteracted by decreased growth from drought, and some research showing that the nitrogen cycle is also a limiting factor. So on balance, are trees going to absorb or emit? There's multiple factors. We can't always know. It's going to be some specific. Then the other aspect of it is wildfires. So what we're seeing, of course, is an increase in wildfire, and we're seeing massive release. I mean, we're talking, I think the number was 2 billion tons of carbon released last year from wildfires around the world. So, so the combination of these things is important. I would argue that the thing about whether it's trees or better soil management to think about is we need to have a better protection and relationship with nature, because that's actually how we protect ourselves, not just from the emission side of it, but the impacts of climate change, water management, coastal erosion, soil erosion, all of those things. And so restoration and protecting nature, and we're talking a massive improvement, is fundamental, even though more wildfires will be a real thing, some limitations because of drought. The fact is we can do a lot more in terms of protection overall.
Okay, thank you. Another question, this one is from Tina. She said, earlier today, I passed the regional garbage facility. They have little chimneys where they burn off methane. Is there any technology for capturing the methane and putting it to use?
Yes, great question. So, and I think it's Malmo in Sweden. You see it in some locations around the world, and it's something that can be done. The first thing to say about methane from landfills, it can be captured, but it does have to be cleaned. There's all sorts of stuff in there. And when they burn it, they actually reduce it from a very powerful greenhouse gas, 20 times more, 84 times more powerful than carbon dioxide on a 20-year basis, but they turn it into carbon dioxide. So it is a step down. Can they capture it and use that gas? Yeah. The gas, of course, is just natural gas. They can power their vehicles with it. They can power all sorts of things with it, but it's got to be cleaned. So sometimes that ends up being something where a municipality might think it's too expensive to do. The federal government is actually going to put more funds into helping municipalities do exactly that and to have more landfills capture methane.
Thanks. Now, there was a question, but a few people have responded in the chat room about suggestions regarding where to invest your funds. And someone has said Shift Action, which I've heard of as well. And also a link here to sending this info to your banks. Do you have any thoughts, Louise, on investment funds or how to have a climate-friendly investment portfolio?
Yeah, it does take work. And I'm sure, I am not the only one with knowledge. Many of you may have found better solutions, but we did finally find somebody at the Royal Bank that's his job. That's his job, is to work with people who want non-polluting portfolios. And we literally go and pick to make sure that nothing in our investments has anything to do with fossil fuels, and we check all the time. But it took an effort to do that, but it's been worth it. I feel better.
And so many banks are big investors in fossil fuel development. I think people are looking at ways to encourage them to divest.
Exactly.
And I think there's some work that is happening on that. Ray McCannell seems to know quite a bit about it. So we might ask her at some point to speak to that. A couple more. This is one for me, actually. We've heard from Kat from Climate Action Network about the just transition and getting government to commit to just transition. Seems to be a big stumbling block for people to get on with dealing with the crisis. Can you comment on that? Do you know where the federal government's at?
Yep. Okay, so that's very timely. I mean, we had quite the debate on this very topic among our network of NGOs in Canada that work on federal climate policy. The federal government had promised to introduce a Just Transition Act. What's interesting is the idea here, just in case folks haven't heard about it before, but the idea is that as we're phasing out rapidly from fossil fuels, that we ensure that workers have opportunities to thrive in the new energy economy. And so the question really is, well, what do we need that we don't already have? What are the gaps in our social safety net, and unemployment insurance and the training programs and things like that? The unions are heavily engaged. And so the conversation we had the other day was around what do we actually need? And so there are folks working on it from the legislative side, trying to identify, what might go into a piece of legislation that says, that workers will be given due respect and care. But having studied this for a while, I'm not actually sure that we need to do a lot more than make sure that our social safety nets work, that we have the training programs in place, that we ensure people get the tax benefits if they're retraining, that kind of thing. I'm much more would like to see, as we saw today with President Biden, if you missed it, an emphasis on climate justice. And dealing with environmental racism, dealing with environmental justice issues, ensuring that all of our society benefits from the changes. So yes, we have to protect workers. We've changed before. It's not clear to me, just my personal opinion, that anything other than what we normally do or making sure it works well is required.
Great, thank you. Now, Linda has asked a question about carbon budgets that
Yep.
I understand are in place in a couple of countries that go towards guiding action and also reporting on that action.
Yep.
Does the Accountability Act go there at all, or is that something we should be looking at?
So great question, because I really think it should have included carbon budgets. What I'm told is that apparently the federal government's thinking is that setting these 5-year legislated targets is kind of your carbon budget, right? In that, by that period, you can only have this much if you're going to reach that target. I would have liked to seen the carbon budget approach. If folks don't know what we are talking about, if you look at the UK as an example, they set a target and they calculate out what that means in terms of how much carbon can be emitted over that period. And then basically it's, you're kind of allocating it and you're making sure you don't exceed certain thresholds along the way. I think it's a really great way to help people understand what we're doing. I mean, we can understand that if we have a budget and we exceed it, we cut back somewhere else. If you're short 1 year, you try to make it up the next year. But there is not going to be carbon budgets apparently in the Climate Accountability Act, at least this round.
Okay, thanks, Louise. We have a question that's sort of near and dear to the hearts of Grands. How can all these great ideas be encouraged in sub-Saharan Africa and other poor countries where priority has to be food security and health? We've heard a fair bit about the adaptation gap and the need for supports there. Do you have thoughts, Louise, about some of these, reductions in emissions and also adaptation measures, how we can encourage and support sub-Saharan African, especially women in those countries?
Yep. So first of all, you are the experts on this side of it. And so I'm learning from you. Let me just say a couple of things that I thought was very interesting about this study that came out today from Oxford University, this global poll. And they did 1.2 million people around the world and countries all around the world. And they have a whole category on sub-Saharan Africa. And what was interesting was there was a strong support in those countries for investing in renewables, right? Getting, essentially the idea of leapfrogging so that we don't go through the fossil fuel dynamic and really get into the renewables. So strong support for that. The fact of the matter is that governments are not doing right by people in the world that are going to suffer the most on climate change. The adaptation gap is real. Those dollars are not going where they should be going. There's corruption to deal with. There's all sorts of issues. I don't know what the solutions are. We go to these UN negotiations and we talk about $100 billion and, how does that get distributed? Who's going to get it? How do we ensure it works on the ground? You'll be better experts on that than me. But I do think that this is a moral question, and that when you see just take Mozambique. I mean, when you see not just the devastation from one tropical storm, but then a second one another year, people don't even get a chance to recover. So it is a moral question, and no government is doing what they should, I think, in my opinion. And I really just have a huge amount of respect for the work you do. So please teach me what you think would be most effective.
Well, thank you. I think we have a couple more minutes for questions. If you want to put a couple of your points in the chat. Or if we can see you put your hand up, we'll try that too, but we don't have, okay, so Patricia Funk, do you want to say something? Go ahead.
I wanted to ask how I send my chat thing. I've got it composed, but I can't figure out.
Well, if you look at the bottom of your screen, Patricia, you'll see a little looks like a talk bubble. It says chat. So
Yeah,
if you open that up and type it there, you just have to return and that will
Yep.
appear right on the screen.
because I've
Yep.
already got it typed up.
But why don't you just ask, do you want to ask your question now that you're here?
Well, it might be simpler. I'm supposed to say that I'm from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, so I'm joining my compatriot Jenny Neal, of course. But I wanted to brag a little bit about an undertaking that has occurred, and I first discovered it through our University of Saskatchewan here in Saskatoon, and that is rooftop gardening, and that's happening in Saskatoon. A brag.
Well, good
It's a
for
great one.
you.
It's a great one.
Congratulations. That's great. That's great.
Yep.
Thanks, Patricia. Oh, yes, Joan is asking, yes, we are recording the presentation and we will make it available for people, but I'm not sure about forwarding it. Janet, you'll have to help us there, but we are recording.
Yep. I did see a question about the federal government announcement of a $5,000 retrofit.
Oh, yes, sorry, I
grant.
did miss that.
And that is coming. Yes, they have announced it. They're designing the program now. And again, that was one of the reasons I suggested go peek at the Natural Resources Canada Energuide website. It's ENERGUIDE. And that's because now the federal government's money will be able to be matched with provincial or utility money. And the goal here is to try to encourage people to do deeper retrofits and get, really steep reductions in energy use in a home. The federal government also announced a $40,000 low interest loan program. But again, all of these things are announced, as Pat will know so well, not yet designed, not yet finalized. Government officials are very busy. And so we have the processes of taking all of these things through cabinet. And I have a dear friend who works in the Prime Minister's office who was sharing with me all of her trials and tribulations to make that happen. But it is happening. It's just taking a bit of time.
Okay, thanks. And sorry, I missed one. That one's an important one. And the home retrofit program has been an on again, off again program. But I think when we had a previous government, they had to bring it back because it was actually so effective and people liked it so much. It really helps a lot. So yeah, if you're looking to do renovations, by all means, look at that. Yeah. Any other questions people wanted to raise? I hope I haven't missed anyone else. Yeah, I don't think I've missed anyone else. I don't see any more questions, but again, Louise, I just wanted to say, and I've seen some of your presentations in the past. You are an excellent presenter. I love those videos. Oh my gosh, they're so good. So thank you very much. They're the kinds of things that, make a difference. People really get it when you bring those to them. I wanted to, just before we turn back to Janet, I wanted to just say a couple of things about our next steps, upcoming seminars. You'll be getting actually a grant action email following this webinar that gives you some specific things you can do, some taken from Louise's presentation and from other sites that we've come upon. And the Climate Strategy Group, of which I'm a member, is planning a second learning event in April, and it will be with Dr. Elizabeth Vibert, who is at the University of Victoria and well known to many Victoria grands. And she's going to be talking specifically about what is happening from her research that she's done, stories of food sovereignty and resilience in South Africa. And that some of you have seen her work and her film that she's done. But this is a way to kind of take this presentation, which gives us lots of what we can do here and helps us to get more into, so what does that mean in sub-Saharan Africa and what can we do to encourage better programming to support reductions and adaptation there. So I'll hand off with a big thank you to Louise, and I'll hand it back off to Janet.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Louise. I also want to thank everybody that tuned in today. So many of you, we're hovering around 70 to 75 participants. Great questions. So as Pat said, there is going to be more to come. In terms of recording this presentation, it is being recorded. What we will do, because these recordings end up being very big files, is we're going to post this in a way, a link to it, so that you can find it on the Grand YouTube channel. And we will be sending out that link probably in a number of ways, but we can include it in the direct message, that action message that Pat just referenced. Also put it in our update, and probably find a nice place for it either on the climate action section of our website or in our learning events section. So stay tuned. This is going to be available to you to share with others, or just to refresh your own memory as to what we discussed today. So thank you, everyone. So great to see all the faces. I'm just going to go to gallery view. There you go. So see all your faces. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And of course, thank you to Louise for bringing this to us today. So stay tuned, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.